Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to formally welcome you to what promises to be a fascinating and exciting event, the 15th Annual Charles W. Johnson Lecture, presented by the Center for the Study of War and Society. I'd like to start by just mentioning a few words about the founder of the center, which continues to thrive to this day. The late Dr. Charles W. Johnson joined the University of Tennessee History Department in 1965 after earning his PhD at the University of Michigan. Until his retirement in 1998 and premature passing, Chuck Johnson played many roles. He taught a variety of undergraduate and graduate level courses, directed a number of MA theses and PhD dissertations, and along the way, deservedly won the UT National Alumni Outstanding Teacher Award. I should mention an experience that faculty in history have to this very day. You're minding your own business somewhere here in shopping or dining in the area, and someone will come up to you and say, I heard you're in the history department. I was a student of Chuck Johnson's. And this happens on a regular basis. It actually happened once to me in Helsinki, Finland, of all places, showing the reach and the influence of this charismatic teacher. In 1981, Dr. Chuck Johnson and the late Professor Charles Jackson published their City Behind a Fence, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, 1942 to 1946, an outstanding and recognized blend of social and military history. Chuck showed his prescience by 3 years later founding the so-called World War II project here at UT, the forerunner of today's Center for the Study of War and Society, which he directed until his retirement. Also, he took a leading role in organizing the university's Normandy Scholars Program. I'd like to recognize in particular Chuck Johnson's wife, Joanne Johnson, who's in the audience today and who was an integral helper in the setting up of the World War II project and then the center in the years that followed. So please join me. It's my hope as the current director that Chuck Johnson would be glad to see the center he established scoring an amazing run of successes. Let me just fire a salvo of the recent ones. Last year, our undergraduate interns won for the first time a UT Undergraduate Research Award for their work on oral histories. In the last 7 years, graduate students in history active at the center have won 9 major national or international graduate research fellowships. And we just learned a month ago that we won, in cooperation with the UT Libraries, a National Archives grant for digitizing our World War II oral histories. We learned also recently of a most generous gift in the will of the late Colonel McKinney in the sum of $100,000 towards the center's activities. But I should mention that the center is always in need of funds and relies on friends like yourselves who share our vision. Let me note, I would be remiss not to note that here on the card table to my left, we have an extensive collection of propaganda literature from the center, including our newsletter, which we publish twice a year. And let me note that the gentleman standing in the back in the pink t-shirt, who is our undergraduate intern this semester, has cards for you to fill out if you'd like to get on our mailing list and to receive copies of our newsletter. Now it's my great pleasure, after that commercial announcement, to introduce our distinguished speaker for today. Dr. Warren Doctor is in fact experiencing what we might call a homecoming. Because even though he is now a distinguished scholar in Britain, he's in fact a graduate of the University of Tennessee and a East Tennessee native. He recently gained his PhD at the University of Nottingham in July 2012. He's taught at the University of Exeter and the University of Worcester and was an Archives Bi-Fellow at Churchill College. His research interest lies in British imperialism in the Middle East during the late 19th and 20th century, encapsulating Orientalism and transnational historical approaches. His first monograph, which by the way is about to appear in a few months from now, so it's going to be breaking news soon, is entitled Winston Churchill and the Islamic World, Orientalism, Empire, and Diplomacy in the Middle East. And it places Churchill in the context of larger colonial discourse and reveals the extent to which Orientalism influenced his opinions and policies about the Islamic world. Warren is currently a research fellow at Clare Hall, Cambridge, where he investigates the diplomatic, political, and cultural influence of the Arabist, counter-Orientalist poet and political radical Wilfrid Blunt on the British policymakers and Arab proto-nationalist thinkers in the Middle East during the Edwardian and interwar eras. After his talk, he has agreed to take questions from the audience, and there also will be a reception to follow for you to get to know him a little less formally. His lecture tonight is entitled The Weight of Islam, Winston Churchill, the Ottoman Empire, and the First World War. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Warren Gottlieb.
Before we get started, I'd first like to thank the University of Tennessee and the History Department in particular, Dr. Ludovichus, for inviting me back. I am absolutely so honored to be at the school which I got my BA from, and I just want to say go Vols. I also see a lot of my friends and family in the crowd tonight, and I just want to thank them for coming out and supporting me. And I also want to apologize to them because I told some of them, particularly Ben Mullins, that it was a free bar. Man, I don't think and also, before I get started, I really have to thank the director of the Churchill Archives, Alan Packwood, for all of his help in helping me put this together and for helping me put my book together. And additionally, I'd like to thank the British Institute at Ankara because through their research initiative grant, have generously funded a lot of the research that has brought this research to fruition. So if we get started, in early January 1915, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the war in Europe, the First World War, the war in Europe, was going to be a total war, and that the Western Front was going to be a war of attrition. To make matters worse, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had recently received news that Mohammed V, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and the Caliph of Islam, had recently declared jihad on the British Empire. The obvious threat to Britain, of course, was its holdings in India. Not so much that the Ottoman Empire would launch an offensive against India, but that the British Muslim subjects in India, having been ordered by the Caliph to wage jihad, might revolt against British rule, much as they'd done in the 1857 Mutiny. Churchill recorded his thoughts in his personal notes. And what he wrote was, "It is in Asia that a natural and appropriate sphere of action will be formed for the unorganized armies of Turkey, where the weight of Islam will be drawn into the struggle on the German side. The Mohammedan influence in Asia will carry with it all kindred forces in Egypt and along the North African shore. It is in Asia, through Mesopotamia and Persia, in Afghanistan, and ultimately India, that England will be struck at and her crown of acquisitions canceled out. India is the target, Islam is the propellant, and the Turk is the projectile." Now we're going to return to this quote later because I think it underlines a lot of interesting ideas that Churchill had here. And I also want to underscore that most people don't really think too much about Churchill's relation with the Islamic world or his relationship with the Ottoman Empire. So what people do tend to think about Churchill's relationship with the Ottoman Empire is that they'll remember the Dardanelles campaign in Gallipoli. And they'll recall that he was one of the primary architects of this very disastrous campaign. Now, students of history will probably be familiar with the usual arguments about the Dardanelles, that Churchill and the British War Cabinet automatically assumed that the Ottoman Empire was somehow an inferior opponent because it was considered racially inferior, because they were Islamic and because they were non-European. And so the British War Cabinet assumed that they would be able to sort of demonstrate their might with a sort of display of naval power, and that would kind of shut down the Ottoman Empire. Churchill enthusiasts, taking it one step further, will probably be familiar with recorded Churchill's raging and his depressions during the Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles campaign. One in particular records Henry Asquith's complaint to his wife that Churchill had become violently anti-Turk and that he would sort of go into a mad rage in the war cabinets. And this is what most people sort of remember about Churchill and the Islamic, or Churchill and the Ottoman Empire, rather. But this isn't the complete picture. In fact, Churchill had a much more complex and dynamic relationship with the Ottoman Empire and with the Islamic world in general than most people ever sort of know about or have considered before. And luckily, there'll be a book coming out on this very topic. And I'd be happy to sell it to you. So what we're going to really talk about today is not so much the defensive and offensive or the military maneuvers, but what influenced Churchill's conceptualization of the Ottoman Empire and how it affected his strategies during the First World War. And hopefully I will illustrate to you a sort of new way of thinking about Churchill in Islam and Churchill in the Ottoman Empire. So, and I just want to say the picture on the left there, or I guess it's your right, is when the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire actually declared jihad, is what that picture is, just so you know. So the best way to think about it, and I'm sorry if my graphics are a bit hokey. I'm not a PowerPoint mastermind or anything. So the first way to think about this is that Churchill's view of the Ottoman Empire sort of rested on three pillars. The first pillar is his view of Islam itself. The second was his sort of Tory worldview, which he inherited from his father, Lord Randolph. And the final was his own personal experiences on the Northwest frontier. So let's begin with his view of the Islamic world. The most famous reflection of Churchill in the Islamic world comes from his book, The River War. And I'm not going to read you the entire quote. What I will tell you is that this particular quote has been used to paint Churchill as Islamophobic and as a bigot, and has basically been taken out of context and used by those with sort of political agendas to sort of hijack Churchill's legacy. So I'll read you some highlights from the quote, just because the quote itself is so long. How dreadful are the curses which Mohammedanism lays on its militaries. Besides a fanatical frenzy, which is as dangerous in man as hydrophobia in a dog, there is a fearful, fatalist apathy. Imprudent habits, slovenly systems of agriculture, sluggish methods of commerce, and insecurity of property exist wherever the followers of the Prophet rule or live. And it goes on to say that while individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, the influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. Far from being moribund, Mohammedanism, which is of course Old English for Muslim, is a militant and proselytizing faith. It has already spread through Central Africa, raising fearless warriors at every step. Now, you'll see this on virtually every internet site. If you write, Churchill and Islam into Google, this quote's going to come up. And this has been used over and over and over to sort of try to illustrate what Churchill's views of the Islamic world are. But this quote is very problematic, and so I'm going to spend a little time deconstructing it and showing why it's wrong. The first thing we have to ask ourselves is where it came from. So we do know it came from Churchill's first edition of The River War. And this is itself sort of difficult because this particular edition only ran for 1 year before Churchill elected to have it stopped in favor of a one-volume edition. And this particular quote was cut out, along with several other quotes that Churchill didn't want sort of revealed. And part of what he didn't want revealed in it is that he had major criticisms for Horatio Kitchener, who waged the war in Omdurman in the Sudan. And you can see if you look here, that's the sort of dome, the Mahdi's dome, which was bombed by the British Army. And Churchill rebukes Kitchener over and over, saying he waged too aggressive a war. And so Churchill wanted to remove this because, of course, he had his political career to consider. The second thing to ask ourselves about this quote is the particular quote that you see on the internet has been creatively edited. It was originally put out by Winston Churchill's grandson, Winston Churchill III. And Winston Churchill III was an outspoken advocate for the Second Iraq War. And he used this to some degree, he was a journalist, and he used this to some degree to sort of give his stamp of approval, to give Churchill's stamp of approval on the Second Iraq War. And the next sort of point we have to think about is that this is taken out of context, the quote itself. Churchill, specifically, let me back up a second. Some of the things that are cut out, creatively edited, are, after it says individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, thousands have become brave and loyal soldiers of the Queen. There's an additional part that's been cut out that basically says that Christianity and Islam are equals, and the only thing that separates them is science. And these are always edited out.